Hello friends, have you ever thought about what would happen if you were to go overboard on an airplane? I'm not referring to skydiving. I mean simply being ejected from the aircraft while wearing just your clothes, hurtling through the air at incredible speed and altitude. How long could a person survive in such a scenario? Is it even feasible? And most intriguingly, who would be bold enough to take such a risk? Our story revolves around a remarkable incident that unfolded under bizarre circumstances, involving a man who was completely unprepared for what happened. The details of this event, which is unique in the annals of aviation history, will astonish you. Make sure to watch this video until the end. On June 10, 1990, at 7:20 a.m., Flight VA5390 left Birmingham Airport in England to take passengers to Malaga, Spain. On board were 81 passengers and 6 experienced crew members. The plane was lifted into the air by co-pilot Alistair, who soon handed over the controls to the crew chief, 42-year-old Timothy Lancaster. Everything went according to plan, and nothing seemed to suggest disaster. The team had already made hundreds of such flights. 13 minutes after takeoff, the plane was over Didcot, Oxfordshire, at 5,300 meters above the ground. The flight was going normally. The pilots had their shoulder straps undone and were relaxed. The aircraft commander loosened his lap straps a little as well. The estimated flight time was about 2 hours, so there was silence in the cockpit after a few jokes. At the same time, the smiling stewardesses started serving food to the passengers. It was early, so many of them were getting ready for a nap and expected to spend the flight in peace and quiet. No one at the time could have imagined that an ordinary flight would quickly turn into a unique survival race. Just as Captain Timothy was settling into his seat, a loud bang came out of nowhere. The human eye didn't even register what had happened. It occurred in a split second. The left windshield, which was on the commander's side, suddenly flew out of the cockpit. The rush of air caused 42-year-old Lancaster, the crew chief, to be violently torn from his seat and propelled through the windshield out of the cockpit. The man's back was pinned to the outside of the fuselage, but luckily his legs were caught between the steering wheel and the dashboard of the plane. The plane decompressed, causing the cockpit door to tear off and fall onto the instrument panel, damaging the connection with the ground. Flight attendant Nigel Ogden, who was also in the cockpit at the time, oriented himself in time and grabbed the captain's legs tightly with his hands, trying to hold on with the rest of his body to the seat. I heard a noise. I turned around and saw that the front window was gone. It had disappeared somewhere, and Timothy was slipping through the opening. He was sucked out, so I could only see his legs, the man later recounted. The co-pilot, Alistair, took control of the plane. He turned on the autopilot and tried to repair the damaged equipment and contact ground services. He had no luck, but after a while, he did see a signal. However, it was of little use. The pilot could not hear the responses from the ground because of the wind noise in the cockpit. It was real chaos because no one had ever trained pilots for this. Meanwhile, the flight attendant's strength began to wane. He felt that he simply could not cope alone and would not be able to hold the commander. But out of the last of his strength, he wrapped his arms around him even tighter and held his legs. He cried out loudly through his teeth and called for help from the rest of the crew, who were already in the cabin. Hearing the screams and realizing that the doors were just gone, 2 stewards came running to him. Despite their combined efforts, the captain slipped out of the cabin a few more inches, with only his shoes and ankles remaining inside. I grabbed Tim's legs, but I almost got sucked out of the cabin myself. At the last moment, the steward John pulled me back in by the strap. Everything in the cabin kept ripping and sucking me out. The oxygen tank, which was securely fastened, nearly blew my head off and flew away like a matchbox. I felt like I couldn't hold Tim any longer. I would have been good for another 20 seconds. Thank God one of the guys strapped his ankle and secured it to the chair. It was unclear what to do next. Everything was flying and rushing around in the cockpit, and most importantly, we realized that we had 81 passengers on board. It would be very difficult to land the plane in such a situation. It was also uncertain how long the other windows would last, as they could fly out after the first one, leading to a definite crash. A few minutes passed like that. Someone suggested we had to let Tim go, but Nigel insisted he would never do that, saying he would have to look his wife and children in the eye. At this time, Nigel himself had already begun to get frostbite. The crew was sure that Lancaster was dead, but they were afraid to let him go because the wind could have thrown his body into the left engine and put it out of action. Flight attendant Susan Gibbon was calling the passengers and asking them to fasten their seat belts. The co-pilot, Alastair, began preparing for an emergency landing and then transmitted a distress signal. Sometimes, the captain's face could be seen through the side window. His eyes were open and unblinking despite the strong air current. Eventually, the crew managed to establish communication with the ground. The co-pilot requested a landing in London at the well-known Gatwick Airport, where he could land with his eyes closed. However, ground services decided to divert Flight BA 5390 to Southampton Airport, which was much closer. 22 minutes after the cabin depressurized, Alastair successfully landed the plane on the airport's second runway at 7:55. There was no emergency evacuation. Timothy Lancaster was lifted into the cockpit and evacuated from the plane on a stretcher. Among the 87 people on board minus 81 passengers and 6 crew members, only 2 were injured. All passengers exited the plane as normal through the regular exits. Among the injured was Nigel Ogden, who suffered a dislocated shoulder, a frostbitten face, and a left eye injury. He looked more like a Navy SEAL who had just returned from combat, but despite all this, he never let go of his friend. The most amazing thing was that when the crew commander was dragged back in, Timothy was not only alive, he was even able to make a joke. During the unbelievable 22 minutes that the captain spent outside the plane at 800 kilometers per hour and at 5,000 meters, he only sustained frostbite, bruises, a fractured right arm, and a finger injury on his left hand. Despite all that, literally 5 months later, the pilot was back at the helm. Following the incident, Captain Timothy Lancaster logged a considerable number of flight hours before retiring at the age of 55, in accordance with British Airways regulations. He is married and has 5 grandchildren. Flight attendant Nigel Ogden returned to work after a brief hiatus but struggled with post-traumatic stress disorder and eventually decided to pursue a different career. Co-pilot Alastair Acheson continued his aviation career for another 25 years. But what led to the windshield detaching from the cockpit? The investigation revealed that 84 of the 90 bolts securing the glass were undersized, and the remaining bolts were 2.5 millimeters shorter than required. The new windshield had been installed just hours before the flight, and the shift supervisor failed to verify the documentation, instead relying on a visual inspection of the bolts, which were similar to those previously used, resulting in a critical error. Dear viewers, we'd love to hear your thoughts on this incident. Please share your opinions in the comments below. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to give it a thumbs up and subscribe to our channel. Thank you for your support.